This is the third video of the market failure series. This video will focus specifically on negative externalities of production and consumption. So in this video, I will explain the concept of negative externalities of production and consumption and show on a diagram how to get the welfare loss associated with the production and consumption of these goods that have negative externalities. I'll also explain the concept of demerit goods and evaluate the different government policies to correct negative externalities. So let's start by focusing on the negative externalities of production. The negative externalities of production are often referred to as external costs. So when do these occur? Well, basically, negative externalities of production occur when the production of a good or service creates external costs that are damaging to third parties. For example, if a factory causes air pollution, this is harmful to the people living in the area. So in that case, the marginal social cost, which is the cost to society as a whole, is higher than the marginal private cost, which is the cost of running the factory itself, because the external cost has to be added to the private cost. So we know that marginal social costs here are equal to marginal private costs plus marginal external costs. This is an example of a misallocation of society's resources, and the real problem here is that there is an over-provision of a good that is causing external costs. So on a diagram, this is what it looks like. We've seen before that the optimal allocation occurs when marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit. This is the optimal allocation. However, in this situation, the marginal private cost is lower than the marginal social cost. So the difference between the marginal social cost and the marginal private cost here is the negative externality. Okay, now the optimal allocation occurs at P star and Q star, which is this point here. But what's actually happening is the production, there's an over provision, the producers are providing QE, and there's a lower price. So because of the negative externalities, there's an over provision of a good, and this triangle here that's shaded in sort of pinkish red, this represents the welfare loss as a result of this over provision. So how can the government intervene to correct this market failure? How can the government correct this over-provision of that good or service that's causing negative externalities? There are three options. Let's take a look and discuss each option. The first option is to tax the firm. Okay, this is a way of internalizing the externality. This is a way of shifting the marginal private cost, the MPC curve, upwards. However, there are many questions that the government has to answer. For example, the government first has to know how much pollution is created. Pollution is not something that's very easy to measure. The government should also attempt to calculate how much should the tax be. How do you determine the tax rate? Who is actually polluting? And by how much or how much pollution are they causing? And will the tax actually stop the pollution? These are all questions that the government needs to answer and investigate. But this is one option. Tax the firm, impose an indirect tax on the firm, which shifts the MPC curve upwards and internalizes the externality because it increases the costs of production for the producers. So we've had a look at the first option, which is taxing the firm. Let's have a look at the second option. The second option is to pass laws to demand stricter environmental standards. So to actually set higher standards for environmental protection. This also increases the firm's private costs and will also shift the MPC curve upwards. But it may lead to job losses. So that's one of the problems or weaknesses of this policy. And the cost of actually setting up the standards and policing those standards can actually end up being greater than the cost of pollution. So using regulation and laws to demand stricter environmental standards may not always be ideal, but it is an option as well to intervene and correct market failure in the case of negative externalities of production. Now this brings us to option number 3. We've had a look at option 1, which is to tax the firm, and option 2, which is to pass laws to demand stricter environmental standards. So option 3 for correcting market failure in the case of negative externalities of production is to issue tradable emission permits. This is a market-based solution, so it's a solution that turns to the markets. What happens is that the government issues permits or licenses that basically give firms the right to pollute up to a certain level. Firms can buy and sell these permits on the market. This system is referred to as the cap and trade system because it puts a cap on the amount of pollution and it allows you to trade these permits. However, on the negative side, it is quite difficult to actually set an acceptable level of pollution. How do you set a level of the amount of pollution that is allowed? And it is difficult to actually measure each firm's pollution. So as you can see, every policy option has certain advantages and certain disadvantages, and governments have to be able to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of every policy option. As we've mentioned in the previous slide, each of these options, the policy options, are designed to sort of internalize the external cost that is being imposed. So what they do is they actually shift the MPC curve upwards by the amount of the tax. What happens is they shift the MPC curve upwards. It moves from MPC to MPC plus tax. As you can see here, the optimal allocation is P star and Q star, which occurs where marginal social cost intersects with marginal social benefit. By taxing, for example, which has increased the marginal private cost of the producers, this has shifted the MPC curve upwards, closer in a way to the optimal allocation, and you'll see that the welfare loss, this triangle, has actually decreased in size from the situation where there is no government intervention at all. So this has led to less of a welfare loss. Now, if the government could actually add a tax that would shift the MPC curve all the way up to the MSC curve, marginal social cost curve, that would get rid of the welfare loss altogether. But again, that is quite difficult to achieve, and it is quite difficult to measure the sort of the perfect taxation rate that would fully internalize all the external costs. So we've covered the negative externalities of production. Now let's cover the negative externalities of consumption. These occur in the case of consuming demerit goods. So demerit goods are goods or services that are consumed and they impose external costs on third parties. Their consumption basically negatively affects third parties when consumed by individuals. A very good example is cigarettes. Cigarettes, when they are smoked around other people, these people are victims of passive smoking. Driving a car causes air pollution. Playing loud music causes noise to the neighbors. These are all examples of consuming certain goods that negatively affect third parties. In the case of demerit goods, what they result in is that the marginal social benefit, the total benefit to society, ends up being a lot less than the private benefit to the person consuming the product. So marginal social benefit will equal to marginal private benefit minus the marginal external benefit, because the benefit here is actually negative. And the problem here is that there's an overconsumption of the good. So it's the opposite of negative externalities of production, where there is an overproduction of the good. Here, the situation is on the consumer side. There's an overconsumption of the good. So we said here that the problem is there's an overconsumption of the good and that the marginal social benefit is lower than the marginal private benefit. As you can see here, The marginal private benefit curve is higher than the marginal social benefit, and the difference between both curves, that's the negative externality. The optimal allocation occurs at the intersection of the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit curve, which is P star and Q star. But here there is an overconsumption. Instead of consuming Q star, which is the optimum quantity, consumers are consuming Q1. There is an overconsumption of that good. And this triangle here, that is shaded in sort of blue turquoise, is the amount of welfare loss due to that overconsumption. This is, for example, obvious in the market for cigarettes. There is an overconsumption of cigarettes, and they are a demerit good. So there is a situation of overconsumption, and it's not the optimal allocation of resources for society as a whole. So how can the government intervene to correct this market failure? Again, like the case of negative externalities of production, the government has three options. Option one is to ban the consumption of the good or service as a whole, make it illegal. But this could create unemployment. This is one big problem. Taxing the product is often better for the government because it allows it to collect tax revenue. And maybe it's better to place partial bans, like for example, there is no smoking in certain places, banning smoking in public places, for example. Also, the government at the end of the day needs votes, and smokers, well, they vote, and they might not be happy voting for a government that bans smoking. So this is the first option, an evaluation of it, looking at the strengths and weaknesses of that first option, which is to ban the consumption of the good or service as a whole. Banning the consumption, by the way, of the good or service can encourage people to buy it illegally, and it can cause the emergence of a black market, which is another problem. So we've had a look at option number one, which is to ban the consumption altogether, and we've had a look at its strengths and weaknesses. Option number two is to tax the consumption of the product. This will shift the marginal social cost curve upwards. It will increase the social cost, basically, of consuming that good. It also allows the government to collect tax revenue. However, products that are demerit goods like cigarettes, for example, or alcohol, they often have rather inelastic demand because they can be quite addictive and habit forming. And this can often mean that the quantity demanded does not fall as much. At the same time, if the tax is too high, this might encourage people to buy it elsewhere and resell it in black markets. So in a lot of European countries, people just cross the borders to go and buy cigarettes that are cheaper across the border, and then they come back and they resell them. So this creates other problems for the government. So we've seen option one, which is to ban consumption of the good or service altogether, and option two is to tax the consumption of the product. What about option three? Option three is basically, instead of targeting the supply side, is to target the demand side by providing education about the dangers of consumption and maybe fund negative advertising. And that's why we see a lot of advertisements about the negative, harmful effects of smoking, and there are lots of programs introduced in schools, for example, to talk to teenagers about the dangers of consuming cigarettes. This will shift the marginal private benefit curve to the left. It will decrease the demand for the product. However, these policies cost a lot of money, so maybe the government can use the tax money that is collected. And using tax money has an opportunity cost because, well, the government has other projects like building schools, building hospitals. So whenever tax money is spent, there's always an opportunity cost. So again, we're looking at the market for cigarettes, and we're going to see both solutions. So the first solution, which is to impose an indirect tax, this basically decreases the supply of the product. It shifts the marginal social cost curve upwards from S here to MSC plus tax. And this might reduce the quantity being consumed from Q1 back to Q star. So that's solution one, the indirect tax. This targets the supply side of cigarettes. Solution two, which is negative advertising, targets the demand side. So it shifts the marginal private benefit curve downwards to this point where it becomes the marginal social benefit curve. So here, this targets the demand side. And this is the solution of negative advertising, solution number two. Remember, solution number one, which is imposing a tax, will target the supply side. So it will shift the marginal social cost curve. But solution number two, which is negative advertising, will target the demand side, and it decreases the demand for the product. And the idea is to reduce consumption back to Q star. This is the idea of both solutions. Governments often use a combination of both policies or solutions. So, to wrap up, negative externalities. Negative externalities of production is a situation where there is overproduction of a good, where the social costs exceed the private costs. There are external costs imposed on society as a result of producing that good or service, like, for example, a factory that pollutes a city where it's set up. The second type is negative externalities of consumption, and this is a situation where you have the opposite. You've got the marginal social benefits in that case are lower than the marginal private benefits because there is a negative external benefit, an external cost that is imposed. And here, the problem that the government needs to correct is the problem of overconsumption. And we call goods, in this case, we call them demerit goods. And a very good example is cigarettes and alcohol and gambling and things like that, activities and goods and services where the consumption imposes external costs on third parties.